thank you everyone for coming. This is a theme that I try to work on over a number of years, and a few new ideas that I've added to it tonight. And I quite like the theme of how do we actually find within ourselves something with which we can kind of build up a bit of resilience, a bit of meta skills, sort of soul skills about how do we actually stand to meet the future. How do we engage with that in a way that the phenomenon of the world don't overwhelm us. So I'm not going to talk about the phenomenon of the world, but more about what are some of the things we can do as in our own self to meet what it is that we have to meet coming to us each day. So when I'm talking about forgiveness as a spirituality, we often, or there's a tendency possibly to write off forgiveness as something that's rather intellectual, because we've all tried to forgive and yet we remain unforgiven, or the person that we've engaged with in forgiveness still hates us. So it didn't really happen, even though we've said I forgive you all the things.
It was a deal. It was a deal, yeah.
It was a deal, yeah. But the deal was we pretend we've forgiven each other, but really we haven't. That's the subtext, the little sub-clause is you're not really forgiven, but we'll just pretend that we're all okay. So is there something else where forgiveness can be seen as a way of life, as a spirituality? So not forgiveness, I think that I want to take it away initially from a state. You don't reach a finished process with forgiveness. That's the first fallacy that we have to get rid of. Because when something has been done to me that is wrong, you can't undo it. That's a fact in my life. And so how do we honour that? And how do we process that to find some ways that can allow me to meet the future? So one of the things that I want to bring in at the beginning, when we read Steiner about meeting the threshold, so either at death or through some kind of experiences, maybe in sleep, but also meeting the threshold is when we meet our fellow human beings. It's actually a threshold experience. We stand in a presence, and he keeps in various ways coming back to these two dynamics of what out of the past is coming with us, but also how we can help the future unfold. And he names two kind of guardian emotions for us there, which will give us a bit of a guidance possibly for forgiveness. But it's also possibly a guidance in the world. So two of these emotions that he talks about is, if we look at the past, we often have a lot of regrets about not having done as well as we thought we might have wanted to do. It also is regrets probably not quite deep enough when it comes to forgiveness, because we're also looking at shame. Sometimes we are ashamed of what we have done. So the idea of shame as one of the four big emotions that stop us from meeting the future would be one of them. When we look at the future and what's coming to us, we can feel fear, trepidation. I don't know how I'm going to meet whatever it is that comes to me the next time I meet that person that I'm supposed to have forgiven. We sort of can feel all of our energy drawing into our body in fear. In fact, physiologically, the blood centers around the heart, whereas in shame or regret, we can feel the blood coming to the periphery, blushing. So there's these two gestures between shame and fear. The other two big emotions that we won't deal with tonight would be anger and hate. They come as part of the process of forgiveness, of course. But those four big emotions. So how do we deal with shame out of the past is a really important aspect of forgiveness. And so while I'm talking about forgiveness, there's obviously a number of things that we need to take into consideration. The one is, obviously, there are things that have been done to me for which I need to forgive someone. There's also things that I've done that I need to be forgiven for. If I've got regrets about my past, it's possible that there are some people that need process around that. So there's a dual process here, and what I'm trying to say tonight, you need to listen to with both directions in mind. How do we deal with me having to forgive someone, or if I perceive that someone that someone needs to forgive me? Both of those are implicit in the processes that I'd like to bring a little bit to life in our experience here. And it gets quite complex because there is a saying that the only thing worth forgiving is the unforgivable. So getting upset because someone didn't like my opinion is not unforgivable. That's first world problems. I mean, yes, we can have a process of rage and all sorts of things around that, but really we can get through that much more quickly than if something really bad has happened to me, or that I've done something that really requires forgiveness. So that's one of the first steps that we need to sort of assess in ourselves. Is this just a small issue, or is it really something that has deeply impacted upon the integrity of something? And one of the hallmarks, I suppose, I want to go through sort of a few stages of this, is that at first when we look at that, we can say that if there is something unforgivable, there is an objective fact that an injustice has happened. It shouldn't have happened to me, we could say. That shouldn't have happened. I didn't deserve that, question mark. But we have that experience of something has happened to me that has really broken my trust body. So the innocence, something of innocence is destroyed if something unforgivable has happened. Just putting that there out as if you want to, you can go through your own processes with these things. But if an injustice has occurred, one of the hardest things to experience is that often, none of these are exclusive things, I'm just painting gestures, because you can always say, well, that didn't happen in such and such a case, of course. But often, these injustices and breaches of trust are betrayals by someone very close to us. We have an invested relationship, and so we feel betrayed. So that's one of the first sort of steps to look at, is that ultimately, if I need to be forgiven, or if I am trying to forgive, there is actually a betrayal that is often involved with what needs to be forgiven. You've betrayed something, and therefore an innocence, a freeness in the relationship has been lost. The trust body is lost. And that's what I mean by an objective thing that can't be changed. You can't change that was broken. But can we repair it? So in the background to this, one of the things that you can keep listening to is that one of the more profound pictures, I think, that Rudolf Steiner brings about ethics and morality and our inability to act wisely or to act out of virtue, or we could say to act out of our inability to not do harm, is that it is very involved with the body of Christ. So this is forgiveness in the sense out of an anthroposophical world point of view or out of spiritual science. We have to understand the nature of the Christ being. So we have to understand the nature of what is said in the Gospels. What you do to the least of your brethren, you do to me. Now, we could just say, what does that mean? You know, is that just a platitude? But Rudolf Steiner says actually what happens is when the Christ incarnates into the Jesus body, that happens at the baptism, at the mystery of Golgotha in the Gospel of Mark, for example, just before the crucifixion in the Garden of Gethsemane, a youth is seen leaving the garden naked, unclothed, unsheathed, and returns at the resurrection. So there's a young person at the resurrection, the Gospel of Mark. But Rudolf Steiner says we can look at that and go, who is this unclothed being that has left? And he says this is the being, the Christ being that is born through the mystery of Golgotha, but as yet is not cloaked, is not clothed in an astral body or an etherical body or a physical body. That still has to take place through the further evolution of Christianity. And he says we need to really look at this, that what we do to another human being, let's just start there, but of course we could see it in relationship to the animals and the plants and the mineral world, communities. There's so many levels where we could do that, but whatever we do has an effect upon the Christ being in his embodiment, not in his embodiment of Jesus of Nazareth, who offered him a physical and etheric and astral body, but since then. And if we do something that hurts another person, we destroy something of those bodies of the Christ being. So when we do an evil deed, for want of a better word, or an immoral deed, something of the Christ being is lost. If we do something good in various ways, through our actions, we can help build the future embodiment of the archetype of humanity in the Christ being. And he says this imagination is so deeply, well it is, he only speaks of it in very few lectures. This imagination is so profound that he says contemplating this picture gives us a real sense for moral impulses within ourselves. That what we do to a fellow human being either denudes the Christ or takes something away from the Christ's being, or helps build his physical body, his etheric body, and his astral body to be able to work in community into the future. But when we come to the realization that we have done something that is not in our best, out of our best nature, I want to avoid the word evil, but we can use the word evil. It becomes a bit loaded if we keep using that word. But when we do something like that, we can come to the experience that something is lost in the world. Something is gone. Something is gone. But two, something needs healing. So we come to that point where we can go, well, my goodness, I've actually created something here that has caused a loss in the world, a loss in the individual being, a loss in the Christ being, but also a loss in the community body. These are various layers of loss because I missed the mark, as the word sin can be interpreted. But coming to that moment of saying, I've done this deed, I realize I've done this deed, we can feel a drive to want to do a better deed. And this is a really critical part of forgiveness, is that when we do a deed, there is an inscription into the memory body of the world. There's an inscription into the memory body of the individuals involved. And that remains there until such time as the individual comes back and actually does another deed that puts the growth forces of the bodies of Christ into place. So we can't, and he's very precise about this. He says, if we're going to understand forgiveness and moral action and karma in a new sense, in our age, we can't assume that we can. He uses a particular word that I just can't for the moment. I'm going to have to pursue that because it's probably a different word. If one one wants to read these, this is the spiritual foundations of morality. He says, if we really are to understand these things, we have to know that we can't repudiate, lovely word, we can't repudiate our earlier deeds with later deeds. I had to go to the dictionary to work out what repudiate means in this sense. So at one sense, repudiate means we can't deny earlier deeds. You can't say, well, look, I've been good for the last 5 years, so what I did didn't happen. Yeah? How often do we want to do that? I mean, it's happening now in our state. But the other thing is, with repudiate, it means you can't reverse or retreat or rescind on your earlier deeds just because you've done good deeds since. That's not how karma works. You can't say, well, I've been a good boy since then, and so it doesn't really matter what I did before. That's not how it works. How it does work, though, is that karma, when we've done something, so if I'm in a particular location on the earth, and in this day and age, say back when I was in South Africa, I did some stuff that I shouldn't have, partly out of, say, I was a policeman in the police force in South Africa, through no will of my own. I was conscripted, but I still did things on behalf of my community, and therefore am accountable to it. To finish that off, there's an inscription there in Johannesburg caused by what myself and others have done. The reconciliation process has tried to do something with that, but they were granted amnesty. Just say you did it, you don't have to pay for it. Interesting. That was the only way forward at the time, because the punishments would have been, death basically. But if I really look at it, then Steiner says what will happen is that inscription will remain there in Johannesburg until I, Martin, go back and create a new deed of goodness. In a way, the old deed has to be wiped out, replaced. Like the old dying branches of a tree has to have a new tree growing to replace it by my deeds. So we could say that, when we feel called to go around the world or to different places, it's your karma calling you to go there and fix it up. Some of that's going to wait till next time. So I don't know when I'm getting back to Johannesburg, and I'm not sure I did enough good things there before I left. That's something I need to look at. So when we come to this threshold of regrets of the past, but also fear of the future to find out what it is that I'm meeting, Steiner asks us, he says, one of the techniques that we can do with this is to have a good old counsel with yourself. In the old days, that was called confession. You went through a search of conscience, you said, I'm sorry, and then you did, you got your absolution and you did your penance. Those are certainly still very, as far as I'm concerned, those are still actually very important gestures to this looking at what I haven't done, but not in the sense of absolution and saying prayers. Basically, I have to say, I can't have my deed taken away from me. It's not in accordance with our modern world, our modern conception, in a Christian sense, to have my deed taken away from me. It's the most unfair thing to do to someone is to say, don't worry, you don't have to sort this out. Just say 10 Hail Marys. Which in itself isn't wrong. The gesture of prayer is actually a sense of trying to find a more noble place in myself. But more importantly would be say, go and resolve this yourself by, what's a good new word for penance? Doing penance would be finding the moral balancing deed that would clothe the Christ between us through how we behave. So we have to build our own imagination of what it is that I need to do to fix this up. That is really hard because we are shamed when we've done something wrong. We are scared. So these things of shame and fear become a really huge hindrance as I read recently, this wonderful thing, it might have been started, but someone said, I can't think because my thoughts are blocking me. Yeah, so when I've got regrets in me and I think, how do I approach this person? All of that's blocking me actually dropping into the present, and it's stopping me. Like, oh, I'm scared to tell that person because they're going to be cross with me. I can't even begin to think or feel what I actually need to do towards finding a new gesture to this. And this is where forgiveness becomes a spirituality. I think that's enough introduction on that. I've got a little list here of things I need to get through. So, what I'm trying to do is build a picture. If I'm not quite good about this, I have actually written a little blog on this. I'm actually just trying to tell you what I've written on the blog. You can go and read it on my website. But what we're trying to do is we've gone through the betrayal. And what's really important is that this betrayal, this objective deed, this trauma, becomes a guardian memory. It stops us from really, it protects, it stops us. It's not a guardian as in I'm looking after this for you, but it's a memory that stops us from going through a certain process to which I can find a new gesture. So what I want to move to next then is a little bit of a process of how do we actually go through the process of forgiveness. So at first, I want to talk about I'm the person, or talking about the person who needs to do the forgiving, not the person who needs to do the be forgiven. I think it might be slightly different. But if I am the person who needs to do the forgiving, there's some bad news. You're the one who has to do the hard work, not the person who has to be forgiven. And if you think forgiveness is going to get the person to change their attitude towards you, don't even begin forgiveness as a process, because you're going to get disappointed. So mostly the outcomes of forgive and forget, handshake stuff, is perfunctory and important, because possibly we create a social field where we can sit in the same room without really looking at each other. However, if we really want to find the deed that will reclothe this relationship, I need to be, the wounded needs to be the one who does the hard work. Because ultimately, that builds this impulse for something to change much further down the line, which may even be beyond our death. So when we get across the threshold and we meet each other and start to work out what it is that still lives between us, this process of forgiveness will come to fruition in that. So there is that possibility there. And so when we do these things, that again, I'm just going to bring something that has been very meaningful for me, both in my own personal life, but also when talking to people about forgiveness. It is what Prokofiev wrote in his book, The Occult Meaning of Forgiveness. And he talks of these two processes that we can go through. And I'm going to just speak of them here briefly. And he calls them the Michaelic aspect of forgiveness and the Christ aspect of forgiveness. And he works out of the German words for forgiveness of vergeben, which is to forgive, as in giving, and verzeihen, which comes from the word verzichten. And we could translate that word into foregoing. I forgive. And I think we could see, or we can say that one of them is a forgive and forget process, which may require us, it's the harder process actually. But the more secret aspect, or the more powerful aspect of forgiveness, is to forgive and remember. So Caroline Mace, all these people, the wounded healer, you have been hurt. It is objective. It cannot be undone. The Wizard of Earthsea, I don't know if you remember Ursula Le Guin, Ged got a cut, and every time he went to do magic, his scar ached. That's how he knew he had to do magic. But he had to go into the pain of his scar, of his misdeed actually, because he betrayed the mysteries, But he went into the ache of his misdeed to find his magic of transformation. It's a very wonderful picture of forgiveness of himself, so to say. But if we look at this process of this double process, the Michaelic process of forgiving and forgetting, we have a lot of thoughts blocking our thinking. The top three are the 3 R's, as I like to call them. Resentment, rage, and revenge. You hurt me. I'm gonna get you back, and then I'll forgive you. You know. So, but this is a really anger. So this is a really powerful emotion that shouldn't be bypassed, and possibly will never go away in forgiveness. This is why I'm calling it a spirituality, because basically the injustices and the abuses and the traumas that we've experienced are the raw fuel for our Christing our Christ action in the world. We almost, through the suffering of what's happened, and look, I should finish that sentence, through suffering what's happened badly to us, we can find our compassion. That's where we're heading. This doesn't mean all bad things are justified. I'm not trying to say certain things are not karmic, certain things are not okay. So this is not trying to make the unforgivable acceptable. They are still unforgivable. They should not have happened. I mean, that's part of the core experience of betrayal was, that shouldn't have happened to me. And you owe me. You actually owe me if you've done this. And the Michaelic gesture that Prokofiev challenges us to is he says, we can, and this is where I think therapy, counselling, reflection, this counselling with oneself is very important, and some of these things take years of therapeutic help, to come to the point where I can, in a way, consciously hold and say, you owe me this. But I'm going to forgo that debt. I'm going to forgive you your trespasses. I'm not going to call on them, even in the afterlife. You don't owe me anything anymore. Now that is a really huge, hard process to do. To say, yes, I am wounded. I must carry this burden for the rest of my life. I may never be able to function fully as a human being again because of it, but I'm not going to require you to come and fix it up. If you want it, you're welcome to, but I will not hold you accountable for the repayment of that debt. I will forego it. So that's where this forgive and forget the debt that's owed me is important. Hard work. I mean, I don't know, there's situations where I know if something comes up, I'm still going, yep, Dad, you still owe me that one. You know, that kind of feeling. And that's, again, why it is a spirituality, because it is a pathway of building something of how we operate in the world. Then he says that, you know, Prokofiev talks about this forgive and remember. He says, you know, we have this wound, but this wound literally is like the wound of Ged in the Wizard of Earthsea. When we see something in the world, it sparks something in us. Wolfgang and I had a moment before, because I responded to a Facebook thing that he posted 2 minutes before this lecture, and he came in laughing. He said, I thought you were preparing for your lecture. But he was kind of sparked by something out there, and I sort of liked it. But yeah, we sort of, things we see in the world, hunger, COVID, whatever it is, children, there's millions of things that touches that wound, causes our rage our outrage, if it's done, you know, where anger can be transformed into compassion and love. Forgiveness is part of that, but we are outraged. And it's almost like a thorn is put into our wound to remember to love more. So our hurt becomes the crown of thorns in us to do deeds of love more. So not necessarily to the person that I need to, but through doing it to the least of your brethren, I can build this physical body, this etheric body, this astral, the soul body of the Christ by how I am spurred, literally, with this pain, to go, okay, I'm not going to fall into being angry with my perpetrator. I'm going to make a conscious decision to find deeds of love in this situation. And therefore we have a field for moral action. We have a situation where I can do something. But the source of that is my suffering. And that is a spirituality, that's a daily thing, because some of these things that are unforgivable are really big. And they don't go away, and they don't get resolved. But the gesture is to take my resentment and my rage and my revenge away from a one-on-one. And, we can't do this intellectually. So we can do it intellectually. It doesn't work. We can come to social agreements with each other not to, continue fighting in public or whatever. But that's what is underneath there is still underneath there. And that's what we're looking at, is to try and say, how do I come to this capacity within myself to have a daily practice in a way to look at my regrets, to look at the betrayals, and to find a way to say, I'm not going to hold. That might require a lot of prayer, a lot of, that's why he calls it Michaelic. It's actually a lot of sword work, fighting with your own demons to keep this one in check. And then at the same time to make sure I find that how I meet the future is not going to be blocked by these guardian memories. That's why they call guardian memories. We need to build new guardian memories which are there to remind us, so ones that are meeting the future. So we've got guardian memories that are trying to keep us in the past, in our hurt, but can we create through our imaginations another memory that we haven't actually had yet? Can we create, Steiner said, we need to create memories of future events that haven't yet come to pass. So I know tomorrow, or sometime really soon, I'm going to meet something that's going to spark me. These two guardians will arise, and one will, sometimes I'm going to fall into my lesser self and go and lie in bed and cry myself to sleep because I'm, poor me. Or I'm going to allow these future guardian memories to come forward and say, remember to do what's better here for this situation. In so doing, if it's done out of these virtues and these capacities of transformed pain, we can start to experience that we are, producing in a new way. We are adding to the world. So we see a situation where something has happened, that loss has happened, the loss of trust between these two people, but also there's an impact on the being of Christ. Can I do something that will change that? Now that's a risky business, as we know, because if you get involved in other people's fights, you're likely to become embroiled these days. So all sorts of skills are needed around that. But even already witnessing something like that and feeling the compassion for the situation is a deed, even if we can't act outwardly on it. Not trying to back away from outer action, because of course that's where we want to head. So those two gestures are really important. I think I've always worked with those, and I find they are very, very helpful when we dealing on a day-to-day basis with how do I meet the injustices or the things that are coming to me out of the future. How do I draw on my past to do that? So one of the things that we as part of that transforming is that, of course, so I'm just going to recap a little bit. As a trauma, an injustice, as a loss of naivety, a transgression is done against me, I can blame the causality outside of me. One pathway. We can come to an inner reflection of the betrayal of the trauma as an objective deed, and work with the resentment and the rage and the revenge. But I can also go into a hardening with that. If we just sit in the resentment, we can become very hardened in that and not find a new gesture. So one of the ways of getting around that hardening gesture is part of the forgive and forget process, which is known as grief. So what are we grieving as part of the forgiveness process? And how does that grief look? Again, all of these things are never finished, so you can't just grieve for 3 weeks about something. It'll ever and again come up. But I think what we're grieving in forgiveness is the loss of innocence, the loss of that which was taken from me. There's an objective loss there. And that, I know there's different kinds of grief. One of the more interesting descriptions between grief, and I think men and women do the same, but we could say a more feminine form of grief, is to cry a lot and to talk a lot. You know, to talk to your friends, talk to your community, and to cry a lot. The more masculine way, which men tend to embody a lot, is anger. So when men are getting angry, they're often grieving, and women don't get that, or communities don't get that. But women also get angry. They've got a masculine side. So these processes of, you know, it's absolutely okay to be absolutely furious about what has happened to you, but not then to lead that into the revenge actions. I mean, maybe sometimes we can't help that, and that then requires its own process. You then become the one who needs forgiving. Yeah, and so we go on around and around. So yeah, these are very big processes, and I'm talking about them very quickly and possibly a little bit too lighthearted. And some of these we do need community and therapeutic help with. Permission to grieve in the Western society is actually quite a big one. We don't do grief very well in the West. So, you could say with grief, you're trying to get to a point, I'm going to use a word of acceptance. I'm wounded. And I'm going to use a word there. Can I stand at peace with that? Can I be at peace with my wounded nature? That's what grief can really help us with, is to come to a sense of, I was going to say reconcile, but it's not really reconcile. It's more, if anyone's got a better word where one gets to with that. So when we then move on to the other side, we can say the forgive and remember has a call to conscience. So what is conscience, of course, is a big thing in itself. But it's a voice within us that knows, is one way of putting it. And because of what I have experienced in my trauma, in my process of coming to stand with it in a more even middle place, and then trying to find this capacity, we can find compassion. And one of the words that I like to use for compassion, it's more than empathy. I used to try and make them the same, but I've seen recently that empathy is a step before compassion. So empathy is where I see something happening in the world, and I can really live into that because of what I've been through, and I can really live into and be in your experience. Compassion is then loving action, where I actually find a way to be able to act into that situation in a transformative way. So compassion isn't just a sense of acquiescing someone through being able to say you know how they feel. That might be sympathy. So you could go from sympathy to empathy to compassion. Meister Eckhart says compassion is where reason and passion become one. So where my love, my overwhelming forces of love for the goodness of human beings is driven by my reason, and that reason is born of forgiveness. That reason is born of forgiveness. So in this way, I'm trying to promote that this process of forgiveness as a spirituality becomes a way of life, if you want to. So it's not necessarily spirituality isn't how I become more spiritual. Spirituality in this sense is more traditional meaning of the word is how I live my life. This is my philosophy of how I live my life with my fellow human beings as a spirituality. Can forgiveness and compassion become that way of life? And the core of it is that through having forgiven much, or also being forgiven much, I think plays into it in the same way, I can actually find these deeds of compassion in situations. And what I think, as I said in the beginning, is this is not this is not an easy path, and it's not for the light-hearted. It's because every day you will be triggered, because forgiveness is never finished. So anybody who thinks through forgiveness we get rid of our pain, we get to this place where we don't have to look at it anymore, is misguided by the forgive and forget of modern day New Age spirituality, where we can just move on into a more happy place and act out of harmony and love. I think far more realistically, we need to be met with this every day coming to us out of the future. We will find we are in situations where we can feel that what is happening here is uncloaking the higher human being here, the Christ being. Something is getting lost here. Literally, it's not just the clothes are taken off and laid by the wayside. They are gone. They can't be replaced. So how can I be driven out of my empathy here into this compassion of saying, I need to find the right understanding, and then I also need to find the right deed in the sense of the Eightfold Path of how we can redress. I mean, that's one of the ways of looking at how do you redress or reauthor something, but how do we literally recloak the goodness in each human being here, and thereby create deeds out of these virtues that allow the Christ to build an embodiment of soul and life, and even down into the future physical expression in community. Too bad, actually. Got through more than I thought I would. So, these become transformative deeds. So we could say the injustice of betrayal is converted through grief into forgiveness, which births compassion and love. It's beyond empathy to transformative deeds. Yeah. So those are the sort of the basic things. I'd like to just say two more things that may be of value here that could lead to something further. One of the things that I'd possibly like to do is, if this is of interest to explore in more detail, we could actually put on a workshop about some of these things in more, to go into things like how do I deal with those 4 negative emotions, if we want for a bit of it. How do I actually go about that? Because I've sort of just put the theory out today. So that's a possibility at some point to do that somewhere. But there's 2 things that I think are worth mentioning. The one is that I've already spoken about, in the sense of, from an anthroposophical point of view, is what happens to us after we die. So, for those who are not aware of what Steiner says about that, he says that we go into a place that used to be called purgatory in the older versions. In the Eastern tradition, it's known as Karmaloka, or Kamaloka, not Karma, but it's K-A-M-A, which is a location basically where we look at and experience what we've done, and we get to feel these things. We get to feel the regret, we get to feel the impact of the other person, and we come to a desire to fix it up. We come to a will to find the resolving deed. And what I think, if forgiveness becomes a spirituality, we build a faith. Now, in this sense, Steiner doesn't call faith an unquestioning belief in someone's authority. Faith is a process which leads us to spiritual knowledge. Faith is the process that leads us to the experience of the Christ in the etheric, and therefore our new faith, our new trust in the processes of Spirit is based upon we have found or we have experienced the Christ in the etheric. There's a very exciting interpretation of the word faith, because we're sort of really caught up in the old versions of what faith means, where we have to give up what we know. But the more we know the spiritual world, we can be led further and further to this real knowledge of this clothing of the Christ being. But the more we can do forgiveness work here as a spirituality, the more transformative forces we have as we go into Karmaloka. I believe, I don't know if Steiner says this, so I said that I have faith that if we actually manage to go through processes of forgiveness that may not be resolved on this plane. I mean, obviously, if we can have the transformative conversations here on this plane, better still. But even if we have a situation with someone who there's just no ways I'm ever going to be able to meet face to face in this world because the unforgiving was so bad. If I can go through these processes of forgiveness, it will have a balm that will allow our post-death experience of each other to go a little easier. At least that. So I believe we are doing work here in the spirituality of forgiveness that is already karmic work. We're trying to find deeds. We're trying to find ways of moving the immovable, so to say, through these gestures. The other thing that I will quickly, briefly say is that I've also been, I really like the work of Christine Gruvetz. She's done work. There's a book that we don't have down in the shop but could get. More difficulty is Walking with Your Time. How do you become a contemporary of your time? So this is, here I am in late October 2020. Things are coming towards me. I see all these things in the world. I am contemporaneous with them. I live in this world. Do I feel up to meeting it? So if we go back to the opening picture of, I look to me in the past, and I've got regrets, I've got shame. I need to become very aware of what that is, and the process of forgiveness is part of that. But when I look to the future, I feel fear, because how do I deal with other people's inability to do nice things to each other? Regardless where on the spectrum you look at things, from conspiracy to just nasty people. We could also put in there, the problem of evil isn't our problem. Our problem is the problem of goodness. How do you explain that people still do good things to each other in the face of what we experience all the time? We're intrinsically good, but we've kind of lost some of our relationship to that. So if I want to become contemporaneous, and this is just a brief insight into that work, Christine Gruvetz says that when we're looking at the phenomenon, we can begin to see the world that's coming towards me out of the future as asking me a question. It's posing me a challenge, in fact, of redeem me, please. So when I walk down the street and I see something that can be considered an injustice or evil or whatever words we want to give it, and I feel the fear, Steiner says we need to learn to consciously follow the process of how the blood goes to our heart, and to find a way to steel ourselves to a point when you can say, I'm up to that. This is my challenge today. But I'm up to that, because everything that we've been talking about kicks into place, and it becomes a spirituality, my way, and I can say, yes, I've still got to go through fear. They say, feel the fear and do it anyway. Or the more modern one is, well, do it with fear then. Don't even overcome your fear. Like, just do it with fear. You may not be able to get through the fear, but do it. But if we can find that actually this energy can come out of me as a feeling of I am up to what meets me in the future. And coming to that, we can meet what's in front of me and listen for this question, how can redemption be brought to this unclothing of a human in front of me? What is the deed that I can do? And I think all that I've been trying to explain, and I think it works for if I am being forgiven or if I have to forgive, it's a very similar process as to how we come to these deeds of compassion, that then in this moment, a new, I'm going to see if I can just find the exact words for this. It's kind of like the concluding picture of this marvelous lecture cycle. Not going to find it. It's at the end of the third lecture in that book, if you want to read it. So I think I'm just going to leave there, but it's this wonderful picture of when I do things that are not moral, I unclothe the Christ being. I strip away and it's gone. It's not just taken aside. But when I do deeds of moral and love and compassion born of this suffering to transform these virtues, we re-embody the human in ourselves and in the Christ being. So a new thing is born, and therefore what was inscripted as injustice has been replaced with justice. And justice not in the sense of the scales with the sword ready to cut off your head, but justice from the point of view of transformative love. So let's go and turn this off and then we can go into questions.